Somewhere in the distant past, long before written history began, there was a world that existed quietly. And then, almost without warning, it was gone. Not slowly fading, not gradually changing, but disappearing in a way that felt sudden, almost unnatural. For thousands of years, no one spoke of it clearly. There were no detailed records, no complete stories, no maps showing where it once stood. Only fragments remained, scattered across myths, whispered through generations, hidden inside stories that sounded more like imagination than memory. And yet, those stories never fully disappeared. They appeared again and again in different parts of the world among people who had never met each other. Stories of water rising, stories of land being swallowed, stories of a time before and a time after. And if we listen carefully, without rushing, it begins to feel like they may all be remembering the same thing. Now, gently, let us step into this quiet mystery together. Welcome to this slow journey into the past. Take a deep breath and allow your mind to move away from the present moment. There is nothing to solve quickly here, nothing to rush toward. This is not a story that reveals itself all at once. Instead, it unfolds slowly like the tide moving across a silent shore. We begin not with a name, not with a specific place, but with a feeling of a world that once felt stable. Imagine a small community living near the edge of a wide, open landscape. The land stretches far into the distance, green and soft, touched by gentle winds. There are rivers moving quietly, animals passing through familiar paths, and people who have learned over generations how to live in balance with everything around them. They wake with the sun. They rest when the sky grows dark. They do not think of themselves as part of history, because history, as we know it, has not yet begun. Their lives are simple but not empty. They understand the seasons. They notice small changes in the air. They read the land in ways that modern eyes might struggle to understand. And for a long time, everything feels steady, but slowly something begins to change. At first, it is almost too small to notice. The air feels slightly different. The ground in certain places becomes softer than usual. Water begins to collect where it normally does not. No one panics. There is no reason to. Change is a natural part of life, and these people have seen many changes before, but this one does not stop. As days pass, then weeks, then seasons, the changes continue. The water does not go away, instead it grows. Rivers begin to swell beyond their usual paths. The edges of the land feel uncertain. What was once firm becomes unpredictable, and still life continues. People adjust as they always have. They move slightly inland, they rebuild, they adapt. But there is a quiet feeling now. Something difficult to explain. A sense that the land itself is no longer behaving as it should. Now let us pause here for a moment and gently step away from the people just for a little while. Because to understand what they may have experienced, we need to look at something much larger, much slower, much more powerful. Thousands of years before this moment, the Earth was in a very different state. Great sheets of ice covered large parts of the planet, massive, silent, and incredibly heavy. These ice sheets held enormous amounts of water locked away, frozen in place. The world was colder then. The oceans were lower. Land that is now hidden beneath water was once open, dry, and alive. But over time, something began to shift. The planet warmed. Not suddenly, not violently, but steadily. And as it warmed, the ice began to melt. At first, this melting was slow, almost gentle. Water flowed from the edges of glaciers, forming streams and rivers that carried fresh water into the oceans. But as the warming continued, the melting increased. And this is where something important happens. You see, when ice melts, it does not disappear, it becomes water. And when enough ice melts, the oceans begin to rise, not in a single wave, not like the sudden floods we imagine, but in a way that is quiet, steady, and unstoppable. Year after year, the sea moves a little further inland, a few steps at a time, almost unnoticeable until you look back. Now let us return to the people. They do not see rising sea levels. They do not measure changes in meters or calculate time in thousands of years. They simply notice that the place they once stood is no longer there. The path they used to walk now leads into water. The fields they once knew are slowly disappearing. And perhaps at first they believe it will stop, that this is just another phase, another cycle. But it does not stop. Instead, something even more unsettling begins to happen. The rate of change increases. There are moments in Earth's history when slow changes suddenly become faster, when systems that have been stable for long periods begin to shift more rapidly. Scientists today sometimes describe events like these as sudden releases, where large amounts of water once trapped are released into the oceans in relatively short periods of time. To the people living through it, it would not feel like a slow change anymore. It would feel like something has broken. Now imagine this. One evening, everything seems as it always has. The sky is calm, the land is quiet, but sometime during the night or over a short span of days, the water moves much further than expected. Places that were safe are suddenly not. Paths disappear. Homes are threatened. And the horizon, the line where land once met sky, begins to change. This is the moment where quiet concern becomes something deeper. Not panic, but realization. A slow, heavy understanding. That something is happening that cannot be easily reversed. And yet, even now, there is no single event, no single moment where everything is lost. Instead, it is a series of moments, each one slightly more serious than the last, each one taking a little more, until one day the place they once called home no longer exists in the same way. Now, as time passes slowly, something else begins to happen. The people move. They carry with them what they can: tools, memories, small pieces of their lives. But more importantly, they carry stories. Not written stories, spoken ones. Stories of a time when the land was different. Stories of water that kept rising. Stories of a world that felt stable until it was. And as generations pass, those stories begin to change. Not because they are false, but because memory is a living thing. It shifts, it adapts, it becomes shaped by the people who carry it. A story told to children becomes simpler. A story told to a group becomes more symbolic. Details are lost, but meaning remains. And over hundreds, then thousands of years, these memories transform. They become myths, legends of great floods, stories of entire worlds being swallowed by water, stories that sound too dramatic to be real and yet somehow feel familiar. Now let us pause again and gently consider something. What if these stories are not just imagination? What if they are distant echoes of real events? Not perfect records, but emotional memories carried across time. This idea has quietly interested historians, archaeologists, and scientists for many years. Because when we look at different ancient cultures, separated by vast distances, we find something curious. Many of them tell similar stories, stories of a great flood, stories of survival, stories of a time when everything changed. And this raises a quiet question: how could so many different people remember something so similar? Were these just common fears, imagined again and again? Or could they be reflections of something that truly happened long before history was written? We do not have a complete answer, but we do have clues, clues hidden beneath the sea, clues buried in layers of earth, clues that suggest that the world was once very different and that parts of it were lost. Now let us move a little deeper into this idea. Imagine standing on a coastline today. Looking out over the water, it feels endless, calm, almost permanent. But beneath that water, far below the surface, there are places where land once existed. Ancient riverbeds, old valleys, even possible human settlements. In some parts of the world, divers and researchers have found structures, shapes that seem too regular to be natural, stone formations that look like walls, lines that resemble roads. And while not all of these discoveries are fully understood, they invite us to consider something carefully. What if entire landscapes, once lived on by humans, are now hidden beneath the sea? And if that is true, then the idea of a lost world is no longer just a story. It becomes something more real, something more possible. But this leads us to another quiet thought: if such a world existed, and if it was lost, then why don't we know more about it? Why are there no clear records, no detailed maps, no written explanations? The answer may be simpler than it seems. Writing, as we know it, is a relatively recent development. For most of human history, knowledge was passed through speech, through stories, through memory. And memory, while powerful, is not perfect. Over long periods of time, it changes, it softens. It becomes shaped by imagination, culture, and belief. So instead of clear descriptions, we are left with symbols. Instead of exact details, we have emotions. Instead of records, we have myths. And yet those myths remain, quietly waiting. Now, as we sit with this idea, another gentle question begins to form. If the past holds memories of a world that disappeared, then what exactly was that world like? Who were the people who lived there? How did they understand their environment? And what did they feel as it slowly changed around them? We will move into that question next, slowly, carefully, as the story continues to unfold. Now, let us move a little deeper into the world that may have existed before the water came. not as a place of advanced cities or towering structures, but as a quiet, living landscape shaped by nature and understood by the people who lived within it. Imagine waking in that world. The air feels soft, slightly cooler than what many places feel like today. The seasons move gently without extreme changes. Rain comes when it is expected. Rivers follow paths that have been known for generations. There is a rhythm here, a slow, steady rhythm that guides everything. People rise with the light of the sun. There are no clocks, no written schedules, only the natural flow of time. They gather food, tend to small areas of land, observe animals, and pass down knowledge through shared experience. Nothing feels rushed. Nothing feels uncertain. And this sense of stability is perhaps the most important part of their world. Because when something remains the same for a very long time, it begins to feel permanent. Not just reliable, but unchanging. Now, as time passes slowly, we begin to notice something important about these early communities. They are deeply connected to their surroundings, not in a symbolic way, but in a practical, everyday sense. They understand where water collects after rain. They know which areas flood slightly during certain seasons and which areas always remain dry. They can sense small changes in weather patterns. They observe the movement of animals, the growth of plants, the behavior of the sky. Their knowledge is not written, but it is detailed, careful, precise, and built over many generations. So when something unusual begins to happen, they notice. Perhaps not immediately, but sooner than we might expect. At first, it might be a small shift in the river, a bend that changes, a current that feels stronger than before. Then over time, the edges of the river expand. Water spreads a little further into the land. Again, this is not frightening. Rivers change, land shifts. These things are part of life, but this change does not follow the usual pattern. It does not return to normal. Instead, it continues. And here something subtle begins to happen within the community, a quiet awareness, not spoken loudly, not fully understood, but present, a feeling that something is different. Now let us step back for just a moment and look at another part of the world during this same time. Far away from this community, large bodies of ice are continuing to melt. We have already spoken about this, but now we begin to see its deeper effect. As the ice melts, it does not simply raise the oceans evenly everywhere. It changes the shape of coastlines. It alters the balance between land and water. In some places, the change is slow and barely noticeable. But in other places, especially low-lying areas, the effect is much stronger. Water begins to move inward, not as a single wave, but as a steady, quiet force. And when that force reaches certain landscapes, it transforms them completely. Now, let us return again to the people. Their world is still familiar, but only just. The changes are no longer small. The river that once stayed within its boundaries now reaches beyond them more often. Fields that were once dry become damp, then wet. Certain paths are no longer safe. And yet they continue, because leaving is not simple. This is their home. Their memories are here. Their understanding of the world is built around this place. To leave is to step into uncertainty. So they adapt. They move their living spaces slightly higher. They change the way they use the land. They adjust again and again, but there is a limit to adaptation, and slowly they begin to approach it. Now something else begins to change, not just the land, but the stories. When people experience something unusual, they begin to talk about it. At first, the conversations are simple. The river is higher this season. The ground feels softer here. But over time, the tone shifts. The observations become questions. Why is this happening? Has this happened before? Will it stop? And here we begin to see the early form of something very human. The need to understand, the need to explain. But without written records, without long-term data, without knowledge of global changes, their explanations must come from experience and imagination. Some may believe it is part of a natural cycle. Others may feel it is something more unusual, something rare, something not seen before. And as these thoughts are shared, they begin to shape the way the event is remembered. Now, as the water continues to rise, we reach a more difficult moment, the point where staying becomes harder than leaving. This is not a single decision made by everyone at once. It happens slowly. Some families move first. They travel to slightly higher ground. They search for places that feel stable. Others remain, hoping the changes will stop. But over time, more people begin to leave. And as they move, they carry with them more than just physical objects. They carry understanding. They carry memory. They carry the feeling of what has been lost. Now let us pause here and consider something carefully. For us today, moving to a new place is often planned. We can prepare. We can gather information. We can choose where to go. But for them, this movement is uncertain. They do not know what lies ahead. They do not know if the new land will be safe. They only know that the old land is changing in a way they cannot control. And this creates a quiet but powerful emotional shift. A sense of leaving something behind, not by choice but by necessity. Now, as generations begin to pass, the original place starts to fade from direct memory. Children grow up in new locations. They hear stories of the old land, but they have never seen it. To them, it becomes something distant, almost unreal. And this is where memory begins to transform again. The details soften. The edges blur. The story becomes less about specific places and more about the experience. Water rising. Land disappearing, people moving, survival, and slowly these memories begin to take on a different form. They become stories with meaning, stories that teach, stories that explain the world in a simple way. The water came because something changed. The land was taken, but life continued. These things can happen even if we do not understand them. And as these stories are told, they become part of culture, part of identity, part of how people see the past. Now let us gently shift our focus again to something that has puzzled many thinkers. If these events were real, even in a partial or gradual way, why do so many cultures describe them as sudden, as a great flood, as a single event that changed everything? The answer may lie in how memory works over long periods of time. When many small events happen over years or decades, they can feel like one large event when remembered later. The mind gathers them together. It simplifies. It creates a clear beginning and a clear ending. And so, a slow rise of water becomes a single great flood. A long process becomes a moment. And this transformation of memory may explain why flood stories across the world feel so powerful and so similar. Now, as we continue this quiet exploration, another question begins to form. If these stories are based on real experiences, then where exactly did these events take place? Were there specific regions where the changes were more dramatic, places where the land was especially vulnerable? There is one idea often discussed that suggests certain coastal areas which are now underwater were once home to early human communities. Places that are today hidden beneath seas may have once been rich, livable landscapes. And as the sea rose, those places were slowly, then completely covered. In some regions, researchers have found signs that support this possibility. Ancient shorelines, now far below current sea level, old river systems buried beneath layers of ocean sediment. And while much remains uncertain, the pattern is clear. The world we see today is not the same world that existed thousands of years ago. Large parts of it have changed. Some areas have been lost, quietly, completely. Now, as we sit with this thought, something deeper begins to emerge. A realization not about the past alone, but about the nature of change itself. The idea that even the most stable environments can shift, that what feels permanent may only be temporary on a longer timeline. And this idea, though calm, carries a quiet weight, because it reminds us that human life has always existed within a changing world, sometimes slowly, sometimes more quickly, but always changing. Now let us not rush forward. Instead, let us stay here for a moment in this understanding. A world once stable, a change that began quietly, a people who adapted until they could no longer, and a memory that lived on not as history but as story. As time continues to pass slowly, we will begin to explore what these stories became and how they traveled across different cultures, shaping myths that still exist today. But before we move further, take a moment to let this part of the story settle, because what we are uncovering is not just an event. It is a pattern of change, memory, and meaning. And it is only just beginning to reveal itself. As time continues to move gently forward, the story begins to spread. Not in the way we might imagine today, with maps and written records, but slowly, quietly carried by people as they move across the land. Groups that once lived close together begin to separate. Some travel toward higher ground. Others follow rivers inland. Some settle near hills or along new coastlines that feel more stable. And with every step they take, the story travels with them. At first, it remains close to its original form, simple, direct. The water rose, the land disappeared. We had to leave. But as generations pass, something subtle begins to happen. The story starts to change shape, not because it is forgotten, but because it is retold. And each time it is told, it becomes slightly different, a little more detailed in some places, a little more symbolic in others. Now, imagine a group of people sitting together in the evening. A fire burns softly in front of them. The day has ended and the night is calm. Someone begins to speak. They tell the story of the old land, but the children listening have never seen that place. To help them understand, the storyteller adds something, a comparison, an image. Perhaps they say, the water came like a great force covering everything. Or, it felt as if the world itself had changed its mind. These are not exact descriptions, but they carry meaning. They help the listener feel what cannot be directly remembered. And over time, these additions become part of the story itself. Now let us move a little further. As these groups continue to live and grow in different regions, their cultures begin to develop in unique ways. Their languages change, their beliefs evolve, their environments shape how they see the world. And yet, within many of these cultures, something familiar remains, a story of water, a memory of loss, a sense that the past holds something important, something that must not be forgotten. In one place, the story may become a tale of a great flood sent by unseen forces. In another, it may become a warning about balance, about respecting the natural world. In yet another, it may simply remain a quiet memory told without explanation. Different forms, but a similar core. And this is where the mystery deepens. Because when we look at these stories today across different parts of the world, we begin to notice patterns. Not exact matches, but echoes, themes that repeat, ideas that feel connected. And this raises a quiet, thoughtful question. Could these stories, separated by distance and time, share a common origin? Or are they simply reflections of a shared human experience, shaped in similar ways? There is no simple answer, but the possibility itself invites us to look more closely. Now, as we continue, let us gently shift our attention to something else. The physical traces left behind. Because stories are not the only things that remain. The earth itself holds memory. Layers of soil, patterns in rock, changes in the shape of the land. All of these can tell us something if we learn how to read them. In certain coastal regions, scientists have discovered something interesting. Ancient shorelines far below the current sea level. These are places where the land once met the ocean long ago, but today they are submerged, covered by water, hidden from direct view. And this tells us something important. The sea did not always exist where it is now. It moved, slowly but significantly. Now imagine those ancient shorelines not as empty spaces, but as living environments, places where people may have settled, places with access to water, food, and open land. These would have been ideal locations for early communities. And if those areas were gradually submerged, then it is possible that entire ways of life were affected, not suddenly erased, but slowly displaced. And as those communities moved, their knowledge moved with them. Their tools, their traditions, their stories, everything carried forward. Now let us pause again and reflect on something simple yet powerful. If a community loses its home, what does it try to preserve? Not just objects, not just tools, but meaning, understanding, a sense of identity. And often that is preserved through story, because stories are flexible. They can travel, they can adapt, they can survive, even when physical places do not. And so the story of the rising water becomes more than just a memory. It becomes a way of holding onto something that was lost. Now, as time continues its quiet movement, something else begins to take shape. The stories begin to connect with beliefs, with ideas about how the world works. People begin to ask deeper questions. Why did this happen? What caused it? Was it random or meaningful? And in trying to answer these questions, they create explanations, not scientific explanations as we understand them today, but meaningful ones. Explanations that fit within their understanding of the world. And this is where the story begins to transform again. In some cultures, the rising water may be seen as a response to imbalance, a reminder that nature must be respected. In others, it may become a story of renewal, an ending that leads to a new beginning. And in some, it may remain a quiet mystery, something that happened without a clear reason but with lasting impact. Now, as we sit with these ideas, let us move a little deeper still, because there is another layer to this story, one that connects the past to the present. Today, with modern tools and careful study, scientists are able to look back in time in ways that were once impossible. They study ice cores, deep samples taken from ancient glaciers. They examine sediment layers, built up over thousands of years. They analyze patterns in the ocean floor. And through these methods, they have found evidence of significant changes in sea levels during the time period we are exploring. Not just slow changes, but periods where the rise may have been faster than usual. Moments where large amounts of water entered the oceans over relatively short spans of time. These findings do not give us a complete picture. They do not tell us exactly what each community experienced, but they do support something important: the idea that the world was changing in real, measurable ways, and that these changes would have been felt by the people living at that time. Now let us return once more to the human side of this story. Because while the science helps us understand what happened, it is the human experience that gives it meaning. Imagine being part of a generation that lived through this transition. You remember the old land. You have seen it. You know what has been lost. And now you live in a new place, one that feels different, less familiar. And you carry with you the memory of change. You tell your children, they listen, they imagine, they try to understand, but for them it is already becoming something else. Not a direct memory, but a story. And this is how history slowly becomes myth. Not because it is false, but because it is distant. Now, as we move forward, one final thought begins to emerge in this part of the journey. If these stories are echoes of real events, and if the land itself holds traces of those changes, then perhaps the past is not as lost as it seems. Perhaps it is still here in pieces, in fragments, in quiet signs that require patience to see. And maybe, just maybe, the truth was never completely buried, only hidden beneath time, water, and memory. As we continue, we will begin to explore how these ancient flood stories appear across different civilizations and what they might reveal when we place them side by side. But for now, let this idea settle gently. A world that changed, a people who remembered, and a story that refused to disappear. Now let us move even more gently into the part of the story where memory becomes something shared across the world. Because what we have seen so far is quiet and personal, a community, a landscape, a slow, unstoppable change. But as time stretches further, something remarkable begins to appear. The same kind of memory in places far apart, places separated by mountains, deserts, and vast distances. Places where people had no contact with one another. And yet, when we listen closely to their ancient stories, we hear something familiar, a pattern, a feeling, a quiet echo of the same experience. Now imagine for a moment that you are listening to a storyteller from a distant land. You do not understand every word, the language is different, the symbols are unfamiliar. But as the story unfolds, certain images begin to form in your mind. Water rising, land disappearing, people trying to survive. And even without knowing the exact details, you begin to recognize the shape of the story. It feels known. And this is where the mystery deepens, because these stories are not identical. They are not copies of each other. Each one has its own voice, its own culture, its own meaning. But beneath those differences, something remains the same. Now let us explore this slowly. In some ancient traditions, the story speaks of a great flood that covered the land, not just a river overflowing, but something much larger, a transformation of the entire environment. In these stories, people often prepare, sometimes warned in advance, sometimes guided by instinct. They gather what they can. They move to higher ground. They try to preserve life. In other traditions, the story is quieter, less about a sudden event and more about a gradual change, the land becoming less stable, water slowly taking over, communities moving over time. And in these versions, the focus is not on survival in a single moment, but on adaptation across generations. Both types of stories exist, and both feel real in their own way. Now, as we sit with this, a gentle question begins to form. Why do these stories exist in so many places? Is it possible that they are all remembering the same global event? Or could it be that similar experiences happened in different regions at different times, but were remembered in similar ways? This is one of the quiet mysteries that continues to be explored, because the Earth does not change in exactly the same way everywhere. Some areas are more affected than others. Some coastlines are more vulnerable. Some regions may experience faster changes, while others remain more stable. So it is possible that multiple communities in different parts of the world experienced similar rising waters and told their own versions of the story. Not one single flood, but many. Not one single moment, but a pattern repeated across time and space. And yet, the emotional memory feels unified. loss, change, survival. Now let us take a moment to reflect on something very simple. Human beings across all cultures respond to the world in similar ways. We notice patterns, we create meaning, we tell stories. And when something deeply impactful happens, something that changes the course of life, we remember it. Even if the details fade, the feeling remains. And that feeling finds its way into story. Now, as we move a little deeper, there is another layer to consider. The idea that some of these ancient stories may not only describe what was lost, but also what was learned. Because when people experience change, they do not only remember the event, they also remember how they responded to it, how they adapted, how they survived. And these lessons become part of the story, passed down quietly from one generation to the next, sometimes as a warning, sometimes as guidance, sometimes simply as a reminder that change is always possible. Now imagine again that evening scene. A group gathered together, the story being told. But this time, listen a little more closely. The storyteller is not only describing the past, they are shaping the future. They are helping the listener understand something important, that the world can change. That stability is not guaranteed. That awareness matters. And in this way, the story becomes more than memory. It becomes wisdom. Now, as we continue this slow journey, let us turn our attention to something that feels almost hidden. The idea of what might still remain beneath the surface. Because while stories travel through time, the physical world also holds traces. We spoke earlier about ancient shorelines now submerged, but there are also other hints. Small, quiet discoveries. In some parts of the world, researchers have found tools far from where they would normally expect them. Objects that suggest human activity in areas that are now underwater. And while these findings are often incomplete, they add to the larger picture. A picture that suggests that the map of human history may be more complex than we once thought, that some chapters may be hidden, not erased, but out of reach. Now let us pause here and consider something gently. If an entire landscape can be covered by water, then what else might be hidden there? Not necessarily large cities or grand structures, but simple, meaningful places. Paths, settlements, areas where people lived, worked, and understood the world. Places filled with quiet human activity now resting beneath layers of ocean. And if those places could speak, what would they tell us? Would they confirm the stories? Would they add new details? Or would they simply remind us that the past is often deeper than it appears? Now, as time continues its calm movement, we come to another thoughtful point. The relationship between what we know and what we imagine. Because when evidence is limited, imagination often fills the gaps, sometimes carefully, sometimes too freely. And this is where we must move slowly, not rushing to conclusions, not forcing the story to be more than it is, but also not ignoring the quiet connections that appear. Instead, we stay balanced, open but thoughtful, curious but calm. Now, as we sit in this space, a final idea begins to take shape in this part of the story. The idea that the truth, whatever it may be, is not a single, simple answer. It is a combination, a blending of real events, human memory, cultural storytelling, and natural change, each part adding something, each part shaping the whole. And when we listen carefully without rushing, we begin to hear it, not as a clear, loud voice, but as a soft, steady presence. A reminder that something did happen, that the world did change, and that people did remember in the only way they could, through story. As we move forward, we will begin to explore how these ancient memories may connect to specific places and what modern discoveries might be quietly revealing. But for now, allow this part of the journey to settle, a shared memory carried across the world, a pattern repeated in different voices, and a mystery that continues to unfold slowly, patiently across time. Now let us move a little closer to the places where this quiet mystery may have left its strongest marks. Until now, we have been moving through memory, through story, through the gentle transformation of experience into myth. But there is another way to listen to the past, not through voices, but through the land itself, because the earth remembers in its own quiet language, not with words, but with layers, shapes, and patterns that remain long after human memory has faded. Now, imagine standing at the edge of a coastline today. The water stretches out before you, calm, endless, and still. It feels permanent, unchanging. But if you could slowly lower the level of that water, if you could gently pull it back, meter by meter, something remarkable would begin to appear. Land, not new land, but old land, ancient ground that once existed in the open air. Wide plains, long valleys, perhaps even the paths of rivers that no longer flow above the surface. And as this imagined water continues to retreat, the coastline changes. It moves outward, further and further, revealing a world that is now hidden. Now let us sit with that image for a moment, because it helps us understand something very important. The oceans we see today have not always been in the same place. They have moved, quietly, powerfully. And when they moved, they did not simply cover empty space. They covered parts of the human world. Now, as we move gently forward, there is one region that has often been part of this discussion, a place where land and water meet in a very unique way. A place where the shape of the coastline suggests that something may have changed dramatically in the past. Imagine a large body of water connected to the ocean but once separated by natural barriers. A basin holding its own waters. For a long time it remains stable, but as sea levels rise slowly, steadily, the pressure begins to build, and at some point a connection forms. Water begins to flow in, at first gently, but then more strongly, and over time, the level of that basin rises. Now, we do not need to rush to conclusions here. This idea has been explored in different ways with different interpretations. Some suggest a gradual change. Others imagine a faster transformation. But what matters is the possibility that in certain regions, the meeting of rising seas and low-lying land could have created powerful changes in a relatively short time. And if people were living in those regions, they would have experienced something deeply memorable. Now let us return again to the human perspective. Imagine living near such a place. For generations, the environment has been stable. The water level remains predictable. The land feels secure. But then something shifts. Water begins to enter from a direction it never did before. The familiar becomes unfamiliar. The safe becomes uncertain. And this change would not need to be sudden to feel overwhelming. Even a steady, noticeable rise beyond anything previously experienced would leave a lasting impression. Now, as we sit with this idea, let us gently expand our view, because this is not about one single location. It is about a pattern that may have appeared in multiple places: low-lying coastal regions, river valleys near the sea, areas where a small change in water level could have a large effect on the land. And during a time when sea levels were rising globally, these regions would have been especially sensitive. Now, as we continue, something else begins to come into focus: the idea of timing. When exactly did these changes happen, and how long did they last? Modern research suggests that the period after the last great ice age was a time of significant transformation. Ice was melting, water was moving, the planet was adjusting. And during this long transition, there may have been moments where the rate of change increased. Not everywhere, not all at once, but in certain places at certain times. And it is within these moments that human experience and natural change may have come together in a powerful way. Now let us pause again and return to the feeling of the story, because while the details are important, it is the experience that connects everything. A community living in balance, a change beginning quietly, an awareness growing slowly, a movement becoming necessary, and a memory carried forward. This pattern repeats, not just in one place but possibly in many. And this is what gives the story its quiet strength. Now, as we move a little deeper, another thoughtful question begins to appear. If parts of the human world were lost beneath rising waters, what impact did that have on the development of later civilizations? Because when people move, they do not start from nothing. They carry knowledge, skills, understanding of the land, ways of living. And as they settle in new areas, they build again. But this time with memory. Memory of what was lost. Memory of what changed. And this memory may influence how they see the world, how they choose where to live, how they understand nature, how they tell their stories. Now imagine a group that has experienced rising waters. When they settle in a new place, perhaps slightly higher, they may carry a quiet caution, an awareness of water's power, a sensitivity to changes in the environment. And this awareness may shape their decisions. Over time, these decisions become patterns. These patterns become traditions. And these traditions become part of culture. So in a quiet way, the past continues to influence the future, even when the original event is no longer fully remembered. Now, as we sit with this idea, something deeper begins to form. The realization that human history is not just a series of events, but a continuous flow, one moment shaping the next, one experience influencing another. And sometimes The most important influences are not the ones we clearly remember, but the ones we feel. Now let us move gently toward another layer of the story, the idea of rediscovery, because in recent times there has been a growing interest in exploring what lies beneath the oceans, not only for resources but for knowledge, for understanding. And as technology improves, our ability to explore these hidden spaces increases. We can map the ocean floor. We can detect shapes and patterns. We can begin to see what was once invisible. And while much remains unknown, each discovery adds a small piece to the larger picture. A picture that suggests that the boundary between land and sea has always been more fluid than it appears. Now let us pause here and reflect softly. What we are exploring is not a single lost city or a single dramatic event. It is something quieter, more gradual, more human. The possibility that many small worlds across different regions were slowly changed, reshaped, or lost as the Earth itself shifted, and that these changes left behind echoes, echoes in the land, echoes in memory, echoes in story. And when we listen carefully, we can begin to hear them. Not clearly, not completely, but enough to sense that something real lies beneath. As time continues to move gently forward, we will begin to explore how these ancient memories influenced the earliest written histories, and how the first civilizations may have tried to record what was once only spoken. But for now, allow this part of the journey to rest. A hidden landscape beneath the sea, a world that once existed in the open air, and a quiet question still waiting to be fully understood. Now let us move a little further into a time when memory began to take a new form. Until now, everything we have explored has lived mostly in the spoken world, stories carried by voice, memories shaped by repetition, meaning passed gently from one generation to the next. But slowly, almost quietly, something important begins to change. Human beings begin to write, not everywhere at once, not suddenly, but in a few places over time marks begin to appear, simple symbols at first, shapes pressed into soft clay, lines carved into stone. These marks are not yet full stories. They are records, small pieces of information, a number, a name, a sign of something counted or traded. But even in these early forms, something remarkable is happening. Memory, which was once carried only in the mind, begins to take on a physical form. It begins to stay. Now let us imagine this moment. A person sits with a piece of clay. Carefully, slowly, they press symbols into its surface. Each mark has meaning. Each shape represents something understood. And once it is made, it does not disappear when the voice fades. It remains. This is a quiet revolution, because for the first time, the past can be held in place. Not perfectly, not completely, but more firmly than before. Now, as writing develops further, something else begins to happen. Stories begin to be recorded. Not all at once and not in the same way everywhere, but gradually. And among these early written stories, we begin to see something familiar. The same patterns we have been following, the same echoes, but now they are given shape in words. Now let us sit gently with this idea. A story that has been told for many generations, finally being written down. But by the time it is written, it has already changed. It has already been shaped by memory, by culture, by belief. So what is written is not the original event, but the final form of a long journey, a memory that has traveled through time before settling into text. And within some of these early writings, we find descriptions of great floods, not small local events, but something much larger, water covering land, communities struggling to survive, a sense of beginning again after everything has changed. These are not exact historical records in the way we might expect today. They are stories with meaning, but within them there may still be traces of real experience. Now, as we move slowly forward, a quiet question begins to take shape. If these stories were important enough to be written down, what did they mean to the people who recorded them? Why preserve this memory among all others? Perhaps because it spoke of something fundamental, something that shaped their understanding of the world, the idea that life can change, that stability can be lost, that survival sometimes requires movement, adaptation, resilience. And these are not small ideas, they are deep human truths. Now let us pause for a moment and reflect. A long time has passed since the first changes we imagined. Generations have come and gone, landscapes have shifted, cultures have grown. And yet the memory of rising water remains, not always clear, not always consistent, but present. Now, as we continue, let us turn our attention to something else. The difference between remembering and understanding. Because even when a story is preserved, it is not always fully understood. People may know that something happened, but not why. They may describe the event, but not the cause. And this creates a space, a quiet space, where curiosity begins to grow. Questions begin to form. What caused the water to rise? Was it something natural? Was it something rare or something that could happen again? For a long time, these questions remain without clear answers, because the tools needed to understand such changes do not yet exist. But the questions themselves are important. They keep the memory alive. They invite exploration. Now, as time moves further into more recent history, humans begin to observe the world in new ways. They begin to measure, to compare, to look for patterns. And slowly, very slowly, a clearer picture begins to form. The idea that the Earth itself changes, that climates shift, that ice can grow and melt, that oceans can rise and fall. And with this understanding, something interesting happens. The old stories, which once seemed purely symbolic, begin to feel more connected to reality. Not exact descriptions, but reflections, echoes of real processes experienced long ago. Now let us sit with this thought for a moment. A story told by a fire thousands of years ago, a memory passed through generations, a myth written in early text, and now a scientific explanation beginning to align with it, not perfectly, not completely, but enough to suggest that they may be connected. And this connection is quiet but powerful. It bridges the gap between past and present, between memory and understanding. Now, as we move a little deeper, another gentle idea begins to emerge. The idea that history is not always lost in the way we think. Sometimes it is simply hidden in forms we do not immediately recognize, in stories, in symbols, in patterns that only become clear when we look at them from a new perspective. And this is what makes this journey so meaningful. Not the search for a single answer, but the slow uncovering of connections. Now, as we continue, let us return once more to the human experience. Because at the center of all of this are people. People who lived, who observed, who adapted. People who experienced change, not as an abstract idea, but as a reality, and who chose in their own quiet way to remember, to pass something forward, even if they did not know exactly what it meant. And because of that, we are able to sit here now and listen, to follow the thread, to explore the possibility. Now, as this part of the journey comes to rest, we begin to approach another gentle question. If the past holds echoes of a lost world, and if those echoes have shaped stories, cultures, and early understanding, then what does that mean for us today? Not in a dramatic way, not with urgency, but with quiet reflection. What can we learn from a memory that has traveled so far? We will move into that thought next, slowly, carefully, as the story continues to unfold. Now let us move gently into that quiet question, not rushing toward an answer, but simply sitting with it for a moment. If something in the distant past changed the world so deeply, if entire landscapes were slowly lost, if communities had to leave behind everything familiar, then what does that mean for us, here, now? At first, it may feel like a distant thought, something far away, something that belongs only to another time. But as we stay with it a little longer, it begins to feel closer, not in a worrying way, but in a thoughtful one. Because the story we have been following is not just about water, it is about change. Slow, powerful, natural change. And one of the quiet truths of our world is this: change never truly stops. Now, let us take a slow breath and look at this gently. The people in our story did not see the full picture. They did not know about melting ice far away. They did not measure sea levels or track long patterns. They only saw what was in front of them: the river rising, the land shifting, the familiar becoming unfamiliar. And from that, they tried to understand. They observed, they adapted, they remembered. Now in our time, we have a wider view. We can see patterns across the whole planet. We can study the past in detail. We can understand processes that take thousands of years. And yet, in a quiet way, our experience is not entirely different. We also live within a changing world. We also notice shifts, sometimes small, sometimes more visible. And like those who came before us, we try to understand. We ask questions. We look for meaning. Now, this is not a moment for concern or urgency. It is simply a moment for reflection, a gentle awareness that the story of change is continuous. It did not begin with us, and it will not end with us. Now, as we move a little deeper into this reflection, something else begins to appear: a quiet sense of connection. Because when we think about those early communities, we might imagine them as very distant, very different, but in truth, they were not so different from us. They cared about their homes. They understood their surroundings. They shared stories. They tried to make sense of what they experienced. And when something important happened, they remembered in their own way. Now let us pause here and imagine something simple. A person long ago sitting quietly looking out over a landscape that is slowly changing. They may not have the words to explain it fully. They may not understand the cause, but they feel it, they notice it, and they carry that awareness with them. In that moment, they are not so different from us. Now, as time continues its gentle movement, we begin to see another layer of meaning in this story. The idea of resilience. Not in a dramatic sense, but in a quiet, steady way. Because despite everything that changed, people continued. They moved, they adapted, they built new lives, they formed new communities, and they carried forward what mattered. This is something that often remains hidden beneath the larger story. The focus is usually on what was lost, but there is also something that continued, something that endured. Now let us sit with that for a moment. A world changes, a place disappears, but life continues. Not exactly the same, not unchanged, but still present, still moving forward. And this quiet continuation may be one of the most important parts of the story. Now, as we move gently toward the next layer, another thoughtful idea begins to form. The idea that the past does not only tell us what happened, it also shows us how humans respond to change. And when we look closely, we see patterns, observation, adaptation, storytelling, memory. These are not new. They have always been part of the human experience. Now, as we sit with this, let us return once more to the stories themselves, the flood stories, the memories of rising water. For a long time, they may have seemed distant, symbolic, even mysterious. But now, after this journey, they begin to feel a little different. Not just stories, but reflections. Not exact records, but meaningful echoes. And when we listen to them now, we might hear something new. Not just what happened, but how it felt. The uncertainty, the movement, the quiet strength of continuing. Now, as we allow this understanding to settle, we come to a gentle point in the story. Not an ending, not a conclusion, but a moment of stillness. A place where everything we have explored begins to come together. A lost landscape, a rising sea, a memory carried across generations, a story that changed shape but never disappeared, and a quiet connection between past and present. Now, we will not close the story here, because there is still more to explore, more layers to uncover, more quiet questions waiting beneath the surface. But before we move forward, let this moment rest. Let the ideas settle softly, like waves returning to the shore again and again without hurry. And when you are ready, we will continue a little deeper into what may still remain hidden and what the future might gently reveal. Now, let us continue a little deeper still. Up to this point, we have been moving through memory, through story, through the quiet transformation of real experiences into something softer, something carried across time. But now we begin to approach a more delicate part of the journey, the space between what is known and what is still uncertain. Because even with all that we have explored, there are still gaps, empty spaces in the story, moments where we pause and simply do not know. And instead of rushing past those spaces, let us sit with them, gently, patiently, because sometimes what we do not know can be just as meaningful as what we do. Now imagine once again that ancient world, not as a fixed place but as something slowly shifting. The water rising, the land adjusting, people moving. We have followed this pattern carefully, but there is a quiet question that remains. Was there ever a moment when the change felt sudden? Not just gradual, not just slow, but something that stood out, something that felt different from all the rest. Because while most changes in nature happen over long periods, there are times when things move a little faster. Moments when systems reach a point and then shift more quickly than before. Not instantly, not violently, but noticeably. Now let us imagine such a moment not as a dramatic event, but as a turning point. For many seasons, the water has been rising slowly. People have been adapting, moving slightly, adjusting their lives. And then, within a shorter span of time, perhaps a few years, or even less, the change becomes more obvious. Water reaches places it has never reached before. Paths that were safe are no longer safe at all. And what once felt manageable now feels uncertain. This is not a sudden disaster in the way we might imagine today, but it is a shift in experience. A moment where gradual change begins to feel immediate. And for the people living through it, this moment would stand out. It would be remembered, not as a long process, but as a turning point. Now, as time passes and that memory is carried forward, this turning point may become the center of the story. The moment everything changed, even if the change itself began long before. And this may help us understand why so many stories speak of a single great event, a flood, a transformation, a clear before and after. Because memory often gathers around moments like these, moments that feel meaningful, moments that feel different. Now, let us move gently forward, because there is another layer to explore. The idea of what might still remain hidden beneath the surface of the world. We have spoken of submerged landscapes, of ancient shorelines now beneath the sea, but let us imagine this more carefully. Not as a single lost place, but as many small places, scattered, separated, each with its own story, each with its own people. And over time, each one affected in its own way by the rising water. Some may have been slowly abandoned. Others may have been left more quickly. Some may have left behind traces, small signs of human life. Others may have disappeared almost completely. And this is why the evidence is so quiet, so difficult to piece together, because we are not looking for one clear answer. We are looking at a pattern spread across many places over a long time. Now, as we sit with this idea, something else begins to appear, a deeper sense of humility, the understanding that our knowledge, even today, is still growing, still incomplete, and that the past, especially the distant past, often holds more than we can fully see. Now let us return again to the people at the center of this story. Because while the land changes, while the water moves, it is their experience that gives meaning to everything. Imagine a final moment before leaving, a person standing at the edge of their home, looking out over land they have known all their life. They can see the changes. They understand in their own way that something has shifted. And now, they must go, not because they want to, but because staying is no longer possible. There is no dramatic farewell, no clear ending, just a quiet decision, a step taken away from the familiar. And as they walk, they carry something invisible, a memory, a feeling, a story not yet fully formed. Now, as generations pass, that story grows. It becomes clearer in some ways and softer in others. It becomes shared, retold, reshaped, until eventually it becomes part of something larger, part of human understanding, part of how people explain the world. Now, as we move gently toward the next part of this journey, a new question begins to form. If so much of this story has been carried through memory, through myth, through fragments of the past, then what might still be waiting to be discovered? Not in a dramatic sense, not as a sudden revelation, but quietly, gradually, through careful observation and patient study. Because even now people continue to explore, to search, to look beneath the surface, both literally and figuratively. And with each small discovery, the picture becomes just a little clearer. Not complete, but clearer. Now let us pause here and allow this idea to settle. A story with missing pieces, a past that is only partially visible, and a quiet process of discovery still unfolding. As we continue, we will begin to explore how modern exploration and technology are helping us understand these hidden parts of the past, and what they might reveal about the world that was once lost. But for now, let this moment rest. A space between knowing and wondering. A calm, thoughtful pause in the middle of a very long story. Now let us continue gently stepping into the present, not leaving the past behind but bringing it with us. Because what we are about to explore is not a sudden discovery, not a single moment where everything becomes clear, but a slow unfolding, a quiet effort by people in our time to listen to the earth in a new way. For most of human history, the sea was a surface, something to cross, something to fish from, something to look at from the shore. What lay beneath it remained hidden, out of reach, out of sight. But over the past century, this has slowly begun to change, not all at once, not everywhere, but step by step the ability to explore beneath the water has grown. Now imagine this carefully. A vast ocean calm on the surface, but far below a landscape, not empty, not featureless, but shaped like the land we walk on. There are ridges, valleys, plains, and in some places shapes that do not feel entirely natural. Now let us move slowly into this idea. Researchers today use gentle methods to see beneath the water. They send signals, soft pulses that travel downward and return with information. From this, they create maps, not of the surface, but of what lies below. And as these maps become more detailed, something interesting begins to appear. Patterns, lines, structures that seem organized. Now we must move carefully here. Not every pattern is a sign of human activity. Nature itself can create shapes that feel familiar. But sometimes, just sometimes, there are hints that invite a closer look. In certain places, divers have descended into the water slowly, carefully, exploring what these maps suggest. And what they find is often quiet, subtle. Not grand cities or towering ruins, but small, intriguing details, arrangements of stone, unexpected alignments, objects that seem placed rather than formed. And while each discovery is modest, together they begin to form a possibility, not a certainty, but a possibility that some parts of the human past now rest beneath the sea. Now, as we sit with this thought, something else begins to emerge. The idea that rediscovery is not always about finding something large or obvious. Sometimes it is about noticing small things, patterns that do not quite fit, clues that invite patience. Because the past, especially one that is partially hidden, does not reveal itself quickly. It requires time, care, and a willingness to accept uncertainty. Now let us pause for a moment and reflect on how different this is from the way we often imagine discovery. We tend to think of sudden breakthroughs, clear answers, but in reality, understanding often comes slowly, piece by piece, a fragment here, a pattern there, a connection that becomes visible only after long observation. And this is exactly how the story we are following continues to unfold. Now, as time moves forward, technology becomes more refined. The images of the ocean floor become clearer. The ability to explore deeper improves. And with each step, the hidden world becomes just a little less hidden. But even now, much remains unknown. Large areas of the ocean have not been fully explored. Many regions remain difficult to reach. And so, the story remains open, incomplete. Now let us return again to the feeling of this journey. Because while the discoveries are important, it is the connection between past and present that gives them meaning. We began with a quiet idea, a world that may have changed long ago, a memory carried through story, a pattern seen across cultures. And now, we find ourselves in a time where we can begin to look for physical traces of that past, not to prove a single story, but to understand a larger truth, that the earth has changed, that human life has adapted, and that memory in its many forms has preserved something worth exploring. Now, as we move gently toward the next layer, another thoughtful question begins to form. What if the purpose of this story is not only to understand what was lost, but to understand how we remember? Because when we look at the past, we are not only observing events, we are also observing ourselves, how we interpret, how we imagine, how we connect meaning to experience. And this may be one of the quiet lessons hidden within the story. Now let us sit with that idea for a moment. A long journey from an ancient landscape to modern exploration, from lived experience to scientific study, from memory to understanding. And yet the story is still not complete. There are still questions, still spaces where we pause and wonder. Now, as we continue, we will begin to explore one final layer of this unfolding journey. Not an ending, but a gentle reflection on everything we have seen. A quiet coming together of past, present, and the unknown future. But before we move there, take a slow breath. Let the images settle, the rising water, the moving people, the stories carried across time, the hidden landscapes beneath the sea, all of it part of a single, quiet thread. And when you are ready, we will continue just a little further. Now let us continue slowly into this final, quiet layer of the journey, not as an ending, but as a place where everything we have explored begins to rest together, like pieces of a story gently finding their place. We began with a simple idea, a world that may have once existed and then slowly disappeared. Not in a single moment, not with a clear boundary, but through change, through time, through the steady movement of water across land. And as we followed that idea, we moved through many layers. We imagined the people who lived there, the way they understood their surroundings, the moment they began to notice something shifting, the slow realization that the world they knew was changing, and then the quiet decision to move, to leave behind what could not be held onto. Now, as we sit here at this calm point in the story, something gentle becomes clear. This was never just a story about loss. It was also a story about continuation, because even as the land changed, life continued. People adapted. They carried forward what they could, not only tools or skills, but memory. And that memory found its way into story. Now let us reflect on that softly. A memory so important that it survived thousands of years, not in perfect detail, not as a complete record, but as something deeper, a feeling, a pattern, an idea that could not be forgotten. And over time, it became part of something larger, part of culture, part of how people understood the world. Stories of rising water, stories of change, stories of a time before and a time after. Now, as we gently bring all of this together, we can see something that was not clear at the beginning. The truth of this story is not found in a single place, not in one discovery or one explanation. It exists in many forms, in the land, in the sea, in the stories people told, in the questions they asked, and in the quiet connections between all of these things. Now let us pause here and take a slow breath, because there is something peaceful about this realization. The understanding that the past, even when it feels distant, is not completely lost. It is still here, in fragments, in echoes, in the subtle ways it continues to shape the present. Now imagine once more that ancient shoreline, not as it is today covered by water, but as it may have once been. Open, alive, filled with quiet human activity. People walking along paths, gathering food, watching the sky, living their lives without knowing that their world would one day change. And then slowly the water begins to rise. At first, barely noticeable, then a little more and a little more, until the landscape itself begins to transform. And yet, even in that change, there is no sudden end, only movement, only transition. And this, perhaps, is the most important feeling to carry from this story. Not the idea of something disappearing completely, but the idea of something changing and continuing in a different form. Now, as we return gently to the present, we bring that understanding with us, a quiet awareness that the world is always in motion, that what we see today is part of a much longer story, and that even the things that seem permanent are part of that flow. Now there is no need to hold onto every detail, no need to search for a final answer, because this story was never meant to be solved. It was meant to be experienced, felt, considered slowly and calmly. And perhaps as you rest with it, something simple remains, a sense of connection to the past, to the people who lived through change, to the stories that carried their memory forward, and to the quiet truth that even across thousands of years, something of their experience still reaches us. Now, as this journey comes to a gentle pause, let your thoughts slow, like the tide moving in and out without effort. There is nothing more to follow, nothing more to uncover for now. Only a calm space where the story rests, and where you can rest too. We're not quite at the end yet, and it's good that you chose to continue. Because sometimes, just when a story feels complete, a quieter layer begins to appear. Not louder, not more dramatic, but deeper. Now let us gently return not to the beginning, but to a space just beneath everything we have explored. A place where the story becomes less about events and more about awareness. Because if we look carefully, what we have been following is not only the disappearance of a landscape, it is also the way human beings notice change. At first, very slowly, almost unconsciously. A small difference in the air, a slight shift in the water, something that feels unusual but not yet important. And then over time that awareness grows, it becomes clearer, more defined, until it reaches a quiet understanding. Something is different. Now this process, this slow awakening to change, is something that repeats across history. Not only in ancient times, but again and again in many forms. And this is where the story begins to feel very close. Because even now, in our own lives, we experience change in similar ways. Not always as sudden events, but as gradual shifts that become visible only when we look back. Now let us sit with that thought for a moment. The idea that the people in our story were not simply witnesses to change, they were participants in a process they could not fully see. And yet they responded, they adapted, they continued. Now as we move a little deeper, another quiet idea begins to form, the idea of perspective. Because from where we stand today, we can look back and see patterns. We can connect events across time. We can understand causes and effects in ways that were not possible before. But from within the story, from within that ancient moment, there was no clear view, only experience, only observation, only feeling. And this reminds us of something gentle but important. Understanding often comes later, much later, sometimes thousands of years later. Now, as we continue, let us return once more to the hidden landscapes beneath the sea. But this time, not to imagine what they were, but to consider what they represent. Because those submerged places are not only physical locations, they are symbols, quiet reminders that the surface of the world is not the whole story, that beneath what we see there are layers, histories, moments that once existed in the open and are now hidden. And in a way, the same is true for memory. What we remember clearly is only part of what has happened. There are always deeper layers, less visible, but still present. Now, as we sit with this idea, something begins to feel very calm, very steady. The understanding that not everything needs to be fully uncovered to be meaningful, that even fragments, even partial stories can carry truth. Not perfect truth, but human truth. Now let us move gently toward one more reflection, a simple one. If a world can change so slowly, so quietly, that the people within it only begin to understand it over time, then perhaps the most important thing is not to predict every change, but to remain aware, to notice, to observe, to listen, just as they did. Now, this is not a lesson in action, it is simply a quiet observation, a way of seeing the world that feels patient, thoughtful, unhurried. Now, as this final layer settles, we return once more to stillness. The story has not ended in a dramatic way. It has not revealed a single hidden truth that explains everything. Instead, it has done something softer. It has opened a space where past and present gently meet, where memory and understanding sit side by side, where questions remain without needing immediate answers. And perhaps that is where the real meaning rests, not in knowing everything, but in allowing the story to stay just as it is, quiet, unfinished, alive in its own way. Now there is nothing more to add, only a calm sense that the journey has gone as far as it needs to for this moment. And if at some point you feel ready to begin another story, another quiet exploration, I will be here. But for now, let everything rest. Even now, there is still something left to explore, not because the story demands it, but because the silence it leaves behind still carries a question, a very quiet one. And so, instead of ending, let us drift just a little further, not forward in time, not backward into the past, but inward, into the space where all of this settles. Because when we think about a lost world, it is easy to imagine distance, something far away, something separate from us. But the more we sit with this story, the more that distance begins to soften. It becomes less about them and more about something shared, a shared experience of living within a world that changes. Now imagine again, not the land, not the water, but a single moment, a person standing quietly, aware that something around them is not the same as it once was. They cannot explain it fully. They do not have the words for it, but they feel it. And in that feeling, there is both uncertainty and acceptance. This is where the story becomes very simple, very human, because across all of history, across all places, this moment has always existed. The moment when something shifts and we begin to notice. Now, as we sit with that, something else begins to appear, a kind of stillness. Not the stillness of something ending, but the stillness of understanding slowly forming. Because in truth, the story we followed was never only about a vanished land. It was about continuity, about how nothing truly disappears, but instead changes form. The land becomes sea. The memory becomes the story becomes meaning, and the meaning quietly continues. Now let us return one last time to the image of the ocean, calm, endless, holding within it layers of time. If you were to stand at the edge of it now and simply look out, there would be no sign of what once existed beneath. No clear boundary, no visible trace. And yet it is there, not gone, just hidden, and perhaps that is enough. Now there is a gentle comfort in this thought, the idea that the past does not need to be fully uncovered to be real. That something can exist, even if we only understand it in part. And that sometimes the quiet presence of a mystery is more meaningful than a complete answer. Now, as we allow this to settle, the story begins to loosen. Not ending, not closing, just becoming softer, like a memory that no longer needs to be held tightly, like a question that no longer needs to be answered immediately. And in that softness there is space, space to rest, space to simply be. Now there is no more movement needed, no more searching, no more unfolding, only a calm awareness that the journey has reached a natural still point. And from here, everything can slowly fade into quiet, like distant waves moving gently in the dark. Nothing more to follow, nothing more to add, only rest. Continue, there is still a trace of the story lingering, not in words anymore, but in the quiet space they leave behind. And so we continue, not to discover something new, but to sit a little longer with what is already here. Because sometimes understanding does not come from moving forward. It comes from staying just a little while longer. Now imagine that ancient shoreline one last time, not changing, not disappearing, but simply existing as it once did. The air is still. The land stretches out wide and calm. There is no sense yet of what is to come, only presence, only this moment, and within it people living their lives, unaware that one day their world would be remembered in fragments, in stories, in quiet questions asked thousands of years later. Now, as we hold this image gently, something begins to shift, not in the land, but in our understanding, because we no longer see this as something distant. We begin to feel it as part of a continuous flow, a long, unbroken thread connecting moments across time. The past not behind us but beneath us, layered, resting, present in ways we do not always notice. Now, as this thought settles, we can let go of the need to follow the story any further, because it is no longer leading somewhere. It has already arrived at a place of stillness. And in that stillness, there is nothing to solve, nothing to uncover, only a gentle awareness that something once existed, that it changed, and that its memory in some quiet way remains. Now allow everything to soften, the images, the questions, the sense of movement. Let it all become lighter, slower, until it feels less like a story and more like a feeling, a calm, distant echo. And in that echo there is rest. No more continuation is needed, only quiet, only stillness, only the soft understanding that the journey has come to its natural end. Even in this stillness, there is one final, gentle movement left. Not a continuation of events, but a soft widening of the view. Because when a story becomes quiet like this, it no longer belongs to a single place or a single time. It becomes something you can return to in your own way. Now imagine again the ocean, but this time do not look at what is beneath it. Simply notice its rhythm, the slow rise and fall, the steady, repeating motion that never truly stops. And in that rhythm there is something familiar, not because we understand it completely, but because we recognize the feeling of it. A quiet, continuous flow. And in a way, that is what this entire journey has been. Not a straight path with a clear end, but a slow movement like waves, coming forward, fading back, returning again in softer forms. Now, as you sit with this, there is nothing more to follow. No more questions that need to be answered. No more layers that need to be uncovered. Only the awareness that the story has gently dissolved into something simpler. A sense, a mood, a calm understanding that change, memory, and time are all part of the same quiet process. And just like the ocean, they continue whether we are watching or not. Now let that thought drift. No need to hold on to it. No need to explore it further. Just allow it to be there softly in the background. And as it fades, the story fades with it, not ending, just becoming still. Then let us bring this story to its final, gentle rest, not with a sharp ending, but with a soft closing like the last light fading at the edge of the day. And so, the world that once existed remains where it has always been, not fully lost, not fully found, but resting quietly beneath layers of time, water, and memory. The people who lived there are gone. Their footsteps no longer touch the land. Their voices no longer move through the air. And yet, something of them remains, not in clear words, not in perfect records, but in something softer, a feeling carried forward, a memory that refused to disappear completely. Over thousands of years, it changed shape. It became stories. It became myths. It became quiet reflections of something real that once touched human lives. And in those stories, we can still sense it: the rising water, the shifting land, the moment when the familiar became uncertain, and the quiet strength of continuing anyway. Now, as we sit here in the present, there is nothing left to solve, no final answer waiting to be uncovered, because the truth of this story was never meant to be a single, clear conclusion. It was always something deeper, a reminder that the world is always changing, that nothing we see is truly fixed forever, and that human life has always moved alongside that change, adapting, remembering, continuing. Now imagine once more that ancient shoreline, not as it is today, but as it once was, still, open, alive, and then slowly, gently let it fade, not disappear but soften until it becomes part of the distant past once more. A place that existed, a world that changed, a story that remained. And now there is nothing more to follow, no more questions to ask, only a quiet sense of completion. Like the ocean at night, calm, endless, at rest. And as the story settles, you can let your thoughts do the same. Slowing, softening, drifting, until there is only stillness. Only quiet, only rest.